Sign
She
these
thought she was
papers.
living
It's
her
over.
dream until the truth turned it into a nightmare. Everything seemed perfect.
How can you be
Love,
so
trust,
cruel?
a future carefully built piece by piece. But behind the calm surface, deception was growing, waiting for the right moment to break through. And when it finally does, it shatters everything she believed in.
Congratulations, we've
Yet in
finalized
that
the
moment of
adoption
pain,
papers.
something powerful is born, because she refuses to stay broken. She rises, stronger, fearless, and ready to take back control of her life. What was meant to destroy her becomes the very thing that makes her unstoppable. The lesson? Sometimes life reveals the truth in the most painful ways, but that truth sets you free. Strength isn't about avoiding the fall, it's about how you rise after. And the moment you choose yourself, you take your power back. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue creating more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
Ethan chose the peak of his own triumph for the ambush. His wife, Maya, 8 months pregnant and radiant in a silk maternity gown, was standing beside him at a glittering San Francisco gala celebrating his company's latest product launch. As the applause for his keynote speech faded, he guided her away from the swarm of investors and toward a quiet, private lounge. It was there, with the city lights twinkling below them, that he detonated their life together. He told her their marriage felt like a legacy system, slow, outdated, and holding him back. He said his new partner, a brilliant and ruthless venture capitalist named Crystal, represented the future he deserved. He reminded her with surgical cruelty that she'd shelved her own design firm to support his dream, had no personal assets tied to the company, and was now completely adrift. With that, he turned, rejoined the party, and raised a champagne flute with Crystal, a picture of a new power couple. He left Maya standing alone, a forgotten relic in the monument to his success, her hands instinctively moving to shield her unborn child from the silent, shattering implosion of her world. Ethan was certain he had won, that he had executed a clean break that would leave Maya too broken to be a problem. But Ethan, in his blinding ambition, had no idea that the quiet, retired software architect she called Dad, the man he'd dismissed as a hobbyist coder, had secretly built and sold a portfolio of tech patents now valued at over $900 million. And every single share now belonged to Maya. This is a story of cold-blooded ambition and devastating betrayal. It's a tale of a man who discarded a diamond for a shard of glass, and the woman who picked up her own broken pieces to build an empire that would dwarf his. Stay tuned, because the moment Ethan discovers who he really betrayed is a scene you will not want to miss. This story carries a message we feel is vital for everyone. Your value is never defined by someone else's failure to recognize it. The people who walk away aren't taking anything from you. They are forfeiting their place in the incredible life you are about to build. Sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't a fight, but a future so bright and successful that the person who tried to break you becomes nothing more than a forgotten error in your code. If that resonates with you, please tap the like button, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, share this story with someone who needs this reminder, and subscribe so you never miss a video that will empower you. Ethan was convinced his wife would simply collapse. He had rehearsed it in his mind from his corner office overlooking the bay, imagining Maya's quiet and dignified disintegration, and what he felt was an immense sense of liberation. No remorse, no regret, and definitely no affection. He had watched her during the gala, her pregnant silhouette framed against the panoramic city view, and all he could think was how exhausted he was by her. He was tired of her quiet support, tired of her thoughtful questions, and tired of her unwavering belief in him. Tonight was the night. He had been setting the stage for months, waiting for the perfect moment of maximum impact. Most people would think a public celebration was a heartless time to end a marriage, but Ethan saw it as a power move. Maya was emotionally invested in his success, surrounded by his people, in his arena. She would be too stunned to cause a scene, too overwhelmed to fight back. That's what Ethan craved. a swift, decisive merger of his personal and professional lives. No messy emotional due diligence, no protracted negotiations, just a clean cut that would set him free. Hello to everyone joining us and welcome to our channel. Before we dive deeper, please show your support by liking this video and hitting subscribe. We would also be thrilled to see in the comments where you're watching from. Are you with us from Chicago or Singapore or Cape Town or Dubai? It's always incredible to see our global community. Now, back to our story. The atmosphere in the high-tech event space was electric, smelling of expensive perfume and success, punctuated by the pop of champagne corks. It was a classic San Francisco evening, clear and glittering, the kind of night that feels like anything is possible. A curated crowd of about 200 tech elites had gathered, a sea of sleek black dresses and custom-tailored suits. The company, Innovate Dynamics, was Ethan's baby, and this was its coming-of-age party. Maya stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand resting on the firm curve of her belly. A sudden, gentle flutter from within reminded her that she wasn't truly alone. The tiny life she carried felt like a secret, a promise of a different kind of future. But at that moment, Maya felt lost. She felt like a ghost. Her father, David, had always been her anchor in Ethan's turbulent world. When she was a girl, afraid of her first line of code, he'd sit with her for hours, teaching her logic and patience. When she was a young woman, heartbroken after a failed startup, he told her she was a brilliant architect in a world full of temporary scaffolds. After she married Ethan and was absorbed into his relentless climb, her father had called every single evening, not to talk about valuations, but about her day. Now, with her father on a long-planned trip abroad and out of contact, Maya felt completely untethered in the swirling currents of Ethan's ambition. "Are you okay?" her best friend Olivia whispered, touching her arm gently. Maya could only offer a weak smile, but she was nowhere near okay. She hadn't been okay for months, feeling a growing distance from the man she loved. Her eyes scanned the room for Ethan. He was supposed to be by her side, the united front. That's what partners did. They shared the spotlight and supported each other, but Ethan wasn't looking for her. He was standing in a secluded alcove, locked in a low, intense conversation with a woman Maya recognized instantly. Crystal Thorne, the venture capitalist who'd recently become his lead investor. It wasn't just a conversation, his body language screamed intimacy. His focus was entirely on Crystal, his head inclined towards hers. He looked completely detached from Maya, as if she were just another guest he had to greet. Maya whispered his name, Ethan, but her voice was swallowed by the celebratory music. She watched as he reached out and touched Crystal's wrist to emphasize a point, and she saw him give Crystal a private, conspiratorial smile. It was a smile of shared secrets, the kind he used to give only to her. The company's COO was now on the stage. "We are here tonight to celebrate a visionary, a man whose drive and genius, our CEO Ethan Vance, has changed the game." Maya tried to focus, to feel the pride she knew she should, but her eyes filled with hot, blurry tears that she quickly blinked away. Her hands trembled as she cradled her stomach, the baby kicking again, a sharp, sudden protest, as if reacting to the ice water flooding its mother's veins. "I'm so sorry, little one," Maya breathed, her words a silent prayer. "I am so sorry." The speeches went on. Person after person praised Ethan's relentless vision and his singular focus. They spoke of his genius, his ambition, and his incredible partnership with Crystal and her firm. A tech journalist told a story about how Ethan once worked for 72 hours straight to close a deal. An early employee tearfully recalled how Ethan had promised them they'd all get rich, and he had delivered. Maya felt a numb chill through it all, and Ethan never once looked her way. After the final toast, people began to mingle. They came up to her saying things like, "You must be so proud of him," and "What a power couple you two are." She tried to smile, but each compliment felt like a tiny, sharp cut. Then she saw Ethan striding toward her, and Crystal was walking with him. For one dizzying second, she felt a surge of hope. He's bringing his lead investor to celebrate with me. But Ethan wasn't coming to share his victory. He stopped in front of her, his face a mask of cool professionalism, Crystal at his side like a sleek, expensive weapon. "Maya, we need to talk. Tonight." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. "Tonight, Ethan? It's a party. This isn't the place." "It's the only place," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "This is about the future. Crystal needs to be part of this conversation." The chill in his voice was absolute. It wasn't anger, it was the sound of a final transaction being closed. She allowed him to guide her away from the crowd, toward a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the entire party. Her heels felt impossibly loud on the polished concrete floor. He didn't take her to a private corner. He took her to a stage. The room, designed for transparency, now felt like a display case. Her pulse was a frantic drum in her ears. "What's happening, Ethan?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You're terrifying me." He glanced at Crystal, who gave him a subtle, encouraging nod. "Olivia, this is Sophia." The woman offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a polite assessment rather than a greeting. "We felt it was best to be transparent," Ethan said, his expression as placid as a frozen lake. "Our partnership is being dissolved." The words hung in the air, sharp and sterile like antiseptic. She couldn't process them. "What?" Olivia whispered, her hand finding the cool metal frame of a nearby chair to steady herself. "You understand me," he stated, his gaze direct and empty. "I'm moving on. Sophia and I are building a future together." The minimalist living room seemed to warp at the edges. Her other hand instinctively flew to her stomach, a desperate, silent shield for the tiny life within. "But why?" she managed, the sound tearing from her throat. "Ethan, we're about to have a baby. We're starting a family." "That's the unforeseen variable, isn't it?" he replied, his arms crossed. He glanced at Sophia, who took a half step forward. "Olivia," Sophia began, her tone the smooth, practiced calm of a boardroom negotiation. "We've analyzed the situation. A child simply isn't a strategic fit for the life we're architecting." The chilling audacity of this stranger discussing her baby as if it were a line item on a balance sheet stole the air from her lungs. She stared at Ethan, her eyes begging him to intervene. "How can you permit this?" she cried, hot tears of disbelief blurring his cold face. "How can you just stand there while she talks about your own child like some liability? How could you even think something so monstrous?" "I think about a lot of things, Ava," Ethan said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I think this entire marriage was a strategic miscalculation. I think I've been operating at a deficit for years, and I am certain I deserve a higher return on my investment." "Something more?" Ava whispered, the words catching in her throat. "More than what, Ethan? More than me? More than our son?" He gestured with his chin toward the smart glass panel on the wall of their Boston waterfront condo. "The separation terms are uploaded," he said, his tone as sterile as the polished concrete floors. "My digital signature is already logged. You just need to provide yours, and we can consider this chapter closed." Ava stared at the illuminated screen, her hands shaking so violently that the cityscape reflected in the glass trembled. Outside, the lights of the harbor sparkled, a view he had once called their masterpiece. She thought he was packing for a biotech conference in Geneva. Instead, her husband, the man who had promised her everything, was terminating their life together with a secure link while their unborn baby turned inside of her. "Ethan, please," she begged, reaching for him, but he recoiled as if her touch were a contaminant. "Not like this. Not right before you go. I'm carrying your son. We are supposed to be a family." "You should have considered that before you lost your ambition," he said, his voice utterly cold. "Before what?" Ava's voice rose from a whisper to a sharp echo in the cavernous, empty space. "What did I do wrong? Tell me, Ethan, what was my unforgivable failure?" "You got comfortable, Ava," he said, his tone laced with a clinical disdain. You're always exhausted, always so emotional. You just potter around in that little art studio. You stopped innovating. Look at yourself. You've lost your edge. I'm pregnant, she cried out, the dam of her composure finally breaking. I am 32 weeks pregnant with our child. Of course I'm exhausted. Of course my body has changed. How can you be so profoundly cruel? I'm not being cruel, Ethan countered, meticulously straightening the cuff of his bespoke shirt as if finalizing a contract. I'm being efficient. I don't love you, Ava. I haven't for a very long time, and I am done feigning an emotional investment. Ava instinctively wrapped her arms around her belly, feeling the baby give a sudden sharp kick as if reacting to her distress. The room tilted, a wave of nausea washing over her. She wanted to scream, to smash the smart glass panel, to shatter this cold, perfect reality he had constructed. Just sign the document, he said. Let's not make this inefficient for everyone involved. No, Ava replied, her voice trembling but edged with a new, raw defiance. I will not sign it. You don't get to just delete me like an obsolete piece of code. As you wish, Ethan shrugged, completely unaffected. I'll see you in depositions, but believe me, Ava, that's a fight you can't win. You have no leverage, no consistent income since you started consulting, no liquid assets, no real portfolio. That little brownstone your father left you is a rounding error. You have absolutely nothing, and you will be outmaneuvered. Every word was a calculated strike. The most crushing part was its accuracy. Ava had left her senior curator position at his suggestion so she could build her own consultancy and have a stress-free pregnancy. He promised he would manage their finances. He told her to focus on building their family. And she had trusted him because she loved him, because she believed in the future they were designing. How could you do this to us? She choked, the words physically painful to form. How did you become this person? Ethan didn't bother to reply. He glanced at his watch, a perfect picture of impatience. My car's waiting, he said. Sign the papers, Ava. The venture is over. And with that, he picked up his leather briefcase, turned, and walked out. He strode down the long, gallery-white hallway without a backward glance, past the modern art he'd acquired and the household staff he managed. He entered the waiting town car, which pulled silently from the curb and merged into the flow of city lights. Ava watched it disappear before her knees gave out. She slid down the cool plaster wall to the marble floor, a lone figure in an immense, silent home. She cradled her belly and wept, a quiet, racking grief that shook her entire body. Her sister Chloe was the first person she was able to call. Ava, oh my God, what's wrong? Are you okay? Is it the baby? But Ava couldn't form words. Only broken gasps and sobs came out as she clutched her stomach, a guttural sound of pain escaping her as her curated life was smashed to pieces. One of the building's staff must have called Chloe back, worried Ava was in premature labor. Chloe was there in 20 minutes, her face a storm of fury and concern. She helped Ava to her feet, guiding her out of the cold, pristine apartment. Chloe drove her to the old South End brownstone, the one she'd inherited from her father, the one place Ethan had no claim to. He'd always dismissed it, calling it a relic. Chloe got her inside and settled her into a worn wingback chair. She made her a cup of chamomile tea that Ava couldn't drink. She found a heavy knit throw to place over her that Ava didn't feel. She murmured soft, comforting words that Ava couldn't hear. Ava just sat there, staring at the familiar, imperfect plaster ceiling of her father's old house, clutching the cold, sleek tablet that held the wreckage of her world. She couldn't fathom how one conversation could liquidate a decade of shared history. Her husband was gone. She was 8 months pregnant with no stable career, no access to their funds, and no map for what came next. In the space of a single evening, Ava Rhodes had lost her entire life. At least, that's how it felt. For the next week, Ava moved through a thick haze. She would only eat when Chloe sat with her, patiently offering small bites of food. She only slept when her body gave in to utter exhaustion. She ignored her phone, which buzzed incessantly with notifications from Ethan's lawyers, a woman from a top firm whose emails were clipped and demanding, asking if she had reviewed the dissolution terms. She would sit in her father's old library, surrounded by shelves of art history books that still smelled of aged paper and leather, and just gaze out the bay window. The brownstone was completely silent. No sound of a key in the lock, no confident footsteps on the hardwood floors, only the quiet hum of the old house. The tablet sat on the coffee table, its dark screen a constant, silent judgment. With every glance at the packed boxes lining the hallway of their Boston brownstone, a fresh wave of despair washed over Eleanor. Finalizing the separation felt like admitting defeat. It was the end of her marriage, the future she'd imagined, the family she was about to start. Her best friend Chloe visited daily, armed with takeout and a fierce loyalty. "You have to eat, Ellie," she'd insist. "That little one needs their mom to be strong." Eleanor would manage a few bites just to satisfy her, but her appetite was gone. At night, curled up alone in their bed, she would talk to the baby. "I'm so sorry," she'd whisper, her hands wrapped around her swollen belly. "I'm so sorry your father was content to let our dreams gather dust. But I promise you, my love, I will be enough for both of us. I will build us a world full of color and light." The baby would stir, a slow, reassuring tumble, and Eleanor would cry until an uneasy sleep finally took her. Then, one Friday evening, a text from Damien lit up her phone. She almost ignored it, her energy completely depleted. But she'd promised him. "Dinner tonight? Let's celebrate the first day of your new life." Something in the message made her stomach twist, but she typed back a simple yes. "Who is this? My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed. I am a literary historian. I was a close colleague of your mother, Helen Vance. I was on a sabbatical abroad and only just heard of her passing. I am so deeply sorry for your loss, my dear." Eleanor felt the sting of unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Miss Vance," she continued, "I know this is a terribly direct request, but I was hoping I could see her apartment. I believe there are some materials related to her research that are of significant academic importance." Eleanor was baffled. Her research? My mother was a high school art teacher. She painted for herself, but it was just a hobby. A short silence hung on the line before Dr. Reed spoke again, her tone gentle but firm. "Eleanor, please, I must see her studio. This is more important than you can imagine." The conviction in her voice, a quiet authority that cut through Eleanor's fog of grief, made her agree. She gave her the address and arranged to meet the next morning. This wasn't a call from some gallery. This was personal. A tiny flicker of curiosity stirred inside her. Why would a historian be so desperate to see the work of a woman who lived a quiet life and never sold a single canvas? For the first time in a week, she showered. She slipped into a soft cashmere maternity dress and tried to tame the tangles in her hair, carefully avoiding her own reflection. What was the point? Dr. Evelyn Reed arrived precisely at 10 in the morning. She was a woman in her late 70s, impeccably dressed in a tweed blazer, her eyes sharp with intelligence and a surprising kindness. She scanned the small, paint-scented living room, her gaze lingering not on the clutter but on the canvases stacked against the walls. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "You must be Eleanor," she said, her handshake firm. "You have your mother's fire in your eyes." Eleanor led her to the small spare bedroom that had served as the studio, and the older woman gasped. She moved through the space with a quiet reverence, her fingers ghosting over the spines of notebooks and portfolios. "I haven't laid eyes on any of this in 30 years, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Helen was so guarded. After you came along, she just vanished from the art world." Eleanor followed her, a strange tension building in her chest. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "Vanished from what world?" Julian looked at her, his expression unreadable. "My darling," he began, his voice dangerously soft, "your father wasn't just a restorer. He was the alchemist. In the 90s and early 2000s, He was a legend in a world you can't imagine. His forgeries are hanging in private collections and museums across the globe. He gestured vaguely toward the city lights outside their penthouse window. He told everyone he'd retired to a quiet life of scholarship. No one knew he was still the most sought-after artist of his kind. Eleanor could only stare, the words failing to connect in her brain. They were sounds from a foreign film without subtitles. I don't understand, she breathed. Your father, Julian said, his voice laced with an intensity that terrified her, built a portfolio of secrets worth a king's ransom. It's his legacy. It is, without question, the most valuable and dangerous collection of private intelligence in the art underworld. He looked around their luxurious apartment, then his gaze locked on hers, glittering with a strange, possessive light. Ellie, your ex-husband didn't leave you with a problem. He left you an empire. He had secretly built a global network as a ghost painter, creating undetectable forgeries for the world's elite. His last client was on the verge of wiring a final payment of 8 figures. Eleanor's reality fractured. She shook her head. No, that's impossible. My husband restored antique books. We live in a quiet brownstone in Boston. He drives a beat-up Volvo. He wears tweed jackets. He was just an academic. That's because he was the most brilliant actor I have ever known, his contact explained over the encrypted line. He despised that world. His passion was for the craft, the history, and for you. He wanted you to have a genuine life, away from the dangers of his clients, to love him for the man he was, not the secrets he kept. But why wouldn't he tell me? Eleanor pleaded, her voice cracking under a new weight of confusion. Why would he build our entire marriage on a lie? The voice on the phone softened. He had his reasons, Eleanor. Very specific reasons. About 6 months ago, Julian accepted this final commission. He was ready to get out, to be done forever, and focus on what mattered, you and your baby. Eleanor's hand flew to her stomach. Julian had been overjoyed about the baby, already filling a small notebook with sketches for a hand-carved rocking horse. When he structured this last deal, the voice continued, he funneled the entire payment into a newly created anonymous trust for you. How much? Eleanor asked, her own voice a stranger's whisper. The contact sent a single encrypted file to her phone. Eleanor opened it. At the bottom of a page of banking codes was a number. She read it once, twice, a third time, before her mind could even begin to accept it. $12 million. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thin. Eleanor grabbed the arm of her chair to steady herself. That can't be right, she gasped. It is 100% right, the voice confirmed. And according to his final instructions, every cent belongs to you. You are his sole beneficiary, his only heir. Eleanor felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. She couldn't breathe, pressing a hand to her chest as her lungs constricted. Are you all right, Eleanor? The voice asked, a hint of concern in the disembodied tone. Do you need me to send someone? I'm fine, Eleanor choked out. I don't understand. Why hide this from me? The contact paused. Eleanor, your husband knew you were preparing to leave him. What? She looked up as if the person could see her through the phone. Julian was a brilliant observer of human nature. The voice continued. He saw how unhappy you'd become. He noticed how your old colleague, Damien, was suddenly a constant presence, always texting, always steering you into conversations about how your talents were being wasted. He heard you on the phone with your mother, telling her you felt you'd married a man with no ambition. Julian told me, and I quote, Damien doesn't desire Eleanor. He desires what I can create. He's turning her against my quiet life so he can have my skills for himself. A bone-deep chill spread through Eleanor's body. My husband said that? Yes, he was heartbroken, but he was terrified for you, especially after he learned you were pregnant. He wanted to tell you everything, but he feared that if you left him, Damien would find a way to get to you, to use you as leverage to force him to work for his clients. He was afraid you'd be manipulated into a gilded cage. Tears began to trace hot paths down Eleanor's cheeks. He was trying to protect me. Yes, the voice said softly. He made me promise not to reveal the trust until after this final payment cleared. He said that if you still chose to leave him after that, you would need these resources to disappear and protect yourself and your child. He wanted to make sure I and his child would be safe for the rest of our lives. Eleanor shattered. The sobs were violent, racking her entire body, drawn from a place of profound regret she never knew existed. Her husband had seen it all. He had recognized Damien's predatory ambition when she had mistaken it for admiration, and he had spent his last few months building a golden fortress around her, a fortress so impenetrable that no one could ever harm her or her baby. "Oh God, Julian," she wept, the sound raw and broken. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see. I'm so sorry I pushed you away." Eleanor disconnected the call, feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. The grief was a crushing weight, but beneath it, a new feeling began to smolder, a cold, protective fury. Resolve. She walked back into the living room. The draft of the separation agreement Damien had helped her prepare was sitting on the antique writing desk, unsigned. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her laptop, opened a secure document, and began to type. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Project Alchemist. Rule number 1, play the part." She considered her next move. She could expose Damien for the parasite he was. She could tell the world how he had gaslit her into thinking her devoted husband was a loser, but that would only ignite a firestorm, and stress was the absolute last thing her baby needed. No, Clara would be strategic. She would be surgical. Rule number 2, the inheritance remains a ghost. This was the linchpin. Her family's attorney had been crystal clear. If Marcus caught even a whisper of the trust fund before she excised him from her life, he would wage a war of attrition. He would cling to her, desperate to secure a piece of her future. The money was her shield. It was her child's fortress. It had to stay utterly invisible. Rule number 3, the child is the compass. Every single move Clara made from this moment forward would serve one singular goal: to keep her baby safe, cherished, and far from the reach of his toxic influence. Rule number 4, build a new world. Clara couldn't breathe in Chicago anymore. Every restaurant, every street corner was tainted by the memory of a lie. She required a clean slate, a new sanctuary where she could construct a life worthy of the love she thought she had. She reread the list, and a sensation she hadn't felt in months flooded her veins. Control. She was reclaiming the narrative. Picking up her phone, she sent a message to the attorney. "I've reached my decision," Clara typed. "I'm cutting all ties." A short pause, then the reply. "What's your strategy?" "I'm going to tell him I've made up with my husband, that he was right all along. Then I'm disappearing. New phone number and all." "A very sound approach," the attorney messaged back. Clara could almost sense the approving nod. "If you vanish, he has no legal avenue to pursue you or claim any rights to your child's life." Chloe sent the message, her fingers steady on the keyboard. "And there's one last thing," she wrote. "I have to get out of New York, Mr. Hayes. My grandfather, you mentioned he had other properties. Is there a place I can go? Somewhere completely secure?" The response was almost instantaneous. "Your grandfather owned a stunning lakeside estate in northern Michigan. It's over 100 acres of private woods and shoreline, incredibly secluded. I can have a driver take you there tomorrow morning." "Please arrange it," Chloe replied. The next day, Mr. Hayes himself drove Chloe out of the city, leaving the towering skyscrapers behind for the rolling green hills of the countryside. They passed through imposing stone gates, the name Blackwood Point carved into an oak sign, and drove down a winding gravel road flanked by towering pine trees. As they cleared a rise, the view stole Chloe's breath. The house was a masterpiece of rustic architecture, built from dark timber and local stone, with a sprawling deck that overlooked the vast, shimmering lake. A wide stone patio led down to a private dock where a small boat bobbed gently. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the city's exhaust fumes. "My grandfather owned all of this?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He purchased it a decade ago," Mr. Hayes said softly. "He called it his sanctuary. He wanted it to be a refuge for you, a place where his great-grandchildren could run free, surrounded by nature, and completely safe." Chloe pressed her hand against the car window, her gaze sweeping over the dense forest that hugged the shoreline. Looking at the tranquil estate through a film of tears, she realized her grandfather had built this place for a future he envisioned for her, for the great-grandchild he would never get to meet. It was a legacy he never had the chance to give her in person. "I'm staying," Chloe said, her voice firm with a newfound sense of purpose. "This is where I'm going to raise my baby." Mr. Hayes, her grandfather's most trusted advisor, gave a small, supportive smile. "It was always meant for you." In the 2 weeks that followed, Chloe dedicated herself to breathing life back into the estate. A local crew was brought in to air out the lodge and polish the rich wood interiors. Movers carefully transported the few items of sentimental value from the tiny apartment she had once shared with her grandfather. She collaborated with a designer to create a nursery that felt like a cozy forest haven, with walls the color of moss and a mobile of hand-carved woodland animals. A beautiful cradle made from reclaimed birchwood sat in the corner, and the shelves were filled with classic storybooks and handcrafted wooden toys. On the attorney's urgent advice, she also hired a top-tier security firm. They installed a discreet but comprehensive surveillance network covering the entire property, and 2 security professionals were stationed at the main gate 24/7. "No one gets on this property without your direct authorization," the head of security assured her. "You and your child will be completely safe here." Taking his other piece of advice, Chloe scheduled a telehealth appointment with a therapist. Her name was Dr. Lena Petrova, a woman whose warm smile was balanced by a sharp, insightful perspective. "You have weathered an emotional hurricane," Dr. Petrova stated in their first session. "The sudden death of your grandfather, immediately followed by your partner's betrayal while you're pregnant. These are profound traumas that require careful healing." She leaned forward slightly, her tone both serious and compassionate. "Seeking help isn't a sign of weakness, Chloe. It's an act of incredible courage." With Dr. Petrova's guidance, Chloe began to sort through the tangled mess of her emotions. She learned that the rage she felt toward Leo was not only justified, but a healthy response to a deep betrayal. She came to understand that grief wasn't a linear path, but a dense, winding forest with patches of bright sunlight and stretches of deep shadow. Most importantly, she learned that she didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be present for herself and her baby. Slowly, with each passing day, Chloe began to mend. She spent her mornings walking the trails that crisscrossed the woods, the air crisp and clean. She ate hearty, nourishing meals and found herself sleeping through the night for the first time in months. She talked constantly to her unborn child, a soft murmur of promises and dreams. "We're going to be so happy here, little bear," she would whisper, her hand resting on her belly as she watched a family of deer drink from the lake. "We're going to create a wonderful life, just the 2 of us, I promise." And for the first time since her world had been torn apart, Chloe truly believed it. While Chloe was carefully piecing her life back together, Leo was discovering that the glamorous new world he'd constructed was built on a foundation of sand. The fantasy he had pursued was turning out to be an empty and wildly expensive charade. The trouble, as it always does, began with money. Leo sat on a silk settee in their hotel suite overlooking Central Park, staring at the credit card statement. $30,000 in 1 month. A hot flush of anger and panic crept up his neck. "This is impossible," he muttered. Vanessa, his girlfriend, barely glanced away from the vanity where she was applying lipstick, her platinum hair styled in a perfect, sleek bob. "Well, let's see. There's the suite, the black car service everywhere, the shopping sprees on Fifth Avenue, my daily appointments at the wellness spa. And that caterer we flew in from France for the party last week. I get it. I see the charges, Leo snapped. We have to cut back. Now. Vanessa, however, had no intention of cutting back. Leo, I am absolutely finished with hotel living, she announced, turning to face him, a defiant glint in her eyes. I need a proper home. I was thinking a penthouse in Tribeca. It needs to have floor-to-ceiling windows, a full-time doorman, a private gym, and a rooftop terrace for entertaining. You did promise me a certain lifestyle, remember? Vanessa, a place like that is millions, Leo argued, his voice strained. So? She shot back, her tone sharp as glass. You told me your new restaurant was going to be the next big thing. You said you were a visionary. Was that just talk? No, of course not, Leo lied, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. The reality was that his much-hyped restaurant, once lauded as the future of fine dining, was hemorrhaging money. The reason was painfully simple. Leo had become an absentee owner. He was skipping meetings with his head chef, ignoring desperate calls from his suppliers, and missing payroll deadlines. He had become so consumed with Vanessa and their high-profile social life that he had abandoned the very dream that was supposed to finance it. One by one, his investors had pulled their support. With no capital came no income, and with no income, there was no way to afford the five-star hotels, the designer wardrobes, the exclusive parties, and the endless stream of lavish gifts required to keep Vanessa satisfied. To make matters worse, the charming Brooklyn brownstone he'd shared with Chloe, which he had intended to sell for a quick and hefty profit, was languishing on a stagnant market with not a single offer. The venture capitalist blamed a volatile market. Ethan was convinced his chief scientist was incompetent. I just need you to trust the process, he pleaded with Sophia. Give me one more quarter and I'll have the preliminary data stabilized. That's exactly what you said last quarter. Sophia's voice had a sharp, dangerous edge. Their arguments became a nightly ritual, a toxic cycle of accusation and defense. Sophia would lament the capital they were burning through. Ethan would lash out about her lack of faith. She would hint at pulling her firm's funding. He would weave a fresh tapestry of projections and desperate promises. It was a chaotic, accelerating decline. One night, in the middle of a bitter argument, Ethan's phone chimed. It was his attorney, Miss Albright. Ethan, we've had a response we need to discuss immediately, the lawyer said, her voice all business. Olivia has replied to our offer. A huge surge of relief flooded Ethan. It was the first piece of good news in what felt like an eternity. But she has presented her own set of non-negotiable terms, Miss Albright continued. What kind of terms? Ethan asked, the relief instantly souring into a familiar dread. She is filing for full, sole legal and physical custody of the child, and she is petitioning the court for you to permanently and irrevocably terminate all parental rights. That's impossible, Leo yelled into his phone. On the contrary, Leo, it's entirely possible, his attorney said, his voice dry as paper. Let's be candid. You have zero leverage here. If you challenge this, we enter discovery, she'll file for support, and given your current financial exposure, that would be utterly catastrophic for you. Leo opened his mouth to protest, but the fight drained out of him. His attorney was right. He was ruined. A drawn-out legal battle was a luxury he couldn't afford. And if he were honest, a child was a responsibility he never wanted. The threat of a custody battle was just a tool, a cruel way to twist the knife in Clara. All right, Leo seethed, the word dripping with resentment. I'll sign it. A prudent decision, Mr. Davies noted. The courier will have the documents at your door tomorrow. Leo ended the call and glared out at the Boston skyline. Sasha had been observing him from the other side of the room. So that's it? You're just abandoning the baby? She probed. I don't have a choice, he shot back. But what about the support payments? Sasha insisted. You could have squeezed a monthly payment from her. Clara's broke, Leo said, his voice thick with exhaustion. Her father was just some dusty old bookworm with a crumbling house. He probably left her buried in debt. You can't draw water from a dry well. Sasha laughed, a sharp, brittle sound filled with contempt. So you torched your entire career on Wall Street for absolutely nothing? No massive bonus, no trust fund heir, not a single dollar of income. What in the world was your master plan, Leo? You, he roared, his voice breaking. I burned everything down for you. Because you promised me the world. Sasha's tone was sharp enough to slice through steel. And where am I now, Leo? Stuck in a rented condo in the seaport that we can't afford, with a man whose reputation is toxic. Frankly, I'm beginning to feel like tying my future to yours was the single worst investment I've ever made. Her words hung in the air of the sterile apartment, more oppressive than the gloomy weather outside. 2 weeks after that, Leo's signature was on the document, forfeiting all his rights to the child he would have with Clara. The divorce was done. He convinced himself it was a clean slate, a necessary amputation. Yet, in the dead of night, with Sasha sleeping beside him and the city's glow painting stripes on the ceiling, his mind would invariably return to Clara. He found himself wondering where she'd gone. He wondered how she was facing the pregnancy by herself. He wondered, with a hollow ache deep in his stomach, if he had just committed an act of self-sabotage on an epic scale. He tried her phone once, then twice, then 5 times in 1 week. Every call went straight to her dispassionate voicemail recording. Clara, he left in one message, his voice tight with an emotion he couldn't identify. I know I messed everything up. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I'm worried about you and the baby. Just text me, please. Just let me know you're all right. She never responded, not a single word. It was a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and Leo was alone in the quiet, overpriced condo. He was mindlessly scrolling through a high society gossip blog on his tablet, while Sasha was at some influencer luncheon, probably maxing out their last credit card for content. He was skimming headlines about scandals and lavish parties, his mind numb, when a headline made his thumb stop dead on the screen. Art World stunned by revelation of secret Vance collection. Arthur Vance. That was Clara's father's name, but it was a common name. It had to be a coincidence. This couldn't be her father. He tapped the link, the article loaded, and Leo began to read. The international art community is buzzing with the posthumous discovery of the Vance collection, a breathtaking private library amassed by the reclusive scholar Arthur Vance. The bigger shock, however, came from his will, which stipulates that the entire collection, with a pre-auction estimate exceeding $50 million, will be left to a single, previously unknown inheritor. Leo's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He forced himself to continue reading. Sources within the auction world confirm Vance lived a life of quiet anonymity, operating out of a modest brownstone in Boston's South End, giving no indication of the treasures held within. A modest brownstone, a quiet life. Leo's hands started to tremble so violently he could barely hold the tablet. According to the estate's executor, Julianne Croft of Croft & Gable, the entirety of the fortune will be managed in a trust for his only child. Leo felt like all the air had been punched from his lungs. The heir has now been identified as his daughter, Clara Vance, age 30. And then he saw the photograph. It was Clara, but a version of her he'd never known, not the gentle, broken-hearted woman he had abandoned. This Clara was luminous. She was standing in what looked like a grand private library, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant stomach, which was elegantly outlined by a simple cashmere dress. Her hair was perfectly styled, her face was serene, and she wore a soft, self-assured smile that conveyed a profound and unshakable sense of peace. The glossy page of the architecture journal caught his eye. Olivia Sterling, new chair of the multi-billion-dollar Sterling Arts Foundation, pictured outside the foundation's new Chicago skyscraper. Ethan dropped the magazine. It slapped against the glass coffee table, the photograph of Olivia's calm, commanding presence burning into his memory. "No," Ethan whispered, the sound catching in his throat. No, this isn't right. It has to be a mistake. A multi-billion-dollar arts foundation. His ex-wife, the woman he'd written off as a quiet architectural historian, the woman he'd left for someone with more dazzle, was the head of a multi-billion-dollar arts foundation. He had divorced one of the city's biggest patrons of the arts. He had signed away his claim to the unborn child of one of the city's biggest patrons of the arts. He had done it all with a smug sense of freedom, practically skipping out of the lawyer's office, convinced he'd won. Ethan shot up from the couch so fast he sent a minimalist floor lamp crashing onto the polished concrete. He didn't hear it shatter. His vision tunneled, a sick, acidic heat rising from his stomach. Just then, the apartment door clicked open and Sophie breezed in, juggling bags from several high-end boutiques. "Ethan, darling, you won't believe the deal I got it." She stopped cold, her smile vanishing as she saw the look on his face. "What on earth is wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan was speechless, standing there white-faced and shaking. Sophie let her bags fall to the floor and rushed to his side. She spotted the open journal, read the caption under the picture, and then her eyes scanned the full article. She saw the photo of Olivia, poised and powerful. And then Sophie screamed. It was a sharp, furious sound that ricocheted off the apartment's high industrial ceilings. "A multi-billion-dollar foundation?" she shrieked. "Olivia is running a multi-billion-dollar foundation." The fight that followed was the most vicious and poisonous one they'd ever had. For the next hour, they went for the jugular. Sophie accused him of being the most clueless idiot to ever walk the earth. Ethan yelled back that she was the one who had pressured him to finalize the divorce so quickly, so obsessed with starting their glamorous new life together. Sophie spat that if she'd had any inkling about that kind of money, she would have told him to stay married and just keep her on the side. Ethan told her that was disgusting. Sophie just laughed, a bitter, ugly sound, and said he'd lost his right to any moral high ground the moment he abandoned his pregnant wife. They flung accusations and insults at each other like weapons, but beneath the fury was a single, nauseating truth. They had bet everything on their own selfish desires and had just lost the biggest jackpot of their lives. At last, Ethan snatched his keys and wallet from the kitchen island. "Where do you think you're going?" Sophie yelled after him. "To find Olivia," Ethan said, his voice raw. "I'm going to fix this." He drove like a maniac, blasting through red lights and weaving recklessly through the dense Chicago traffic until he pulled up to the glittering steel and glass skyscraper that was the Sterling Foundation. The imposing front doors were locked, and a security guard in a sharp suit immediately approached him. "I need to see Olivia Sterling," Ethan said, his words coming out in ragged breaths. "I'm her husband. Her ex-husband." The head of security at the front desk coolly consulted a tablet. "I'm afraid you are not on the approved access list, Mr. Holt." Ethan's composure snapped. He started pleading, his voice rising in desperation, but a second, much bigger guard materialized beside the first. "Olivia!" Ethan shouted up at the soaring atrium, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "Olivia, I know you're up there. I messed up. I am so sorry. I still love you. Olivia, please." His cries were a pathetic, desperate wail that the marble lobby absorbed without a trace. No one came. The security chief calmly stated that if he did not leave the premises, the Chicago Police Department would be called. Defeated, Ethan stumbled back to his car. For 5 long minutes, he just stared up at the tower, a monument to his failure, waiting for a sign that he knew would never come. What Ethan didn't know was that Olivia was watching the entire spectacle unfold on a security feed in her 40th floor office. She saw his frantic waving, heard the faint, distorted sound of his yelling through the monitor's speaker, and she felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no triumph, not even a shred of pity, just a vast, quiet stillness. She laid a hand over her growing belly, feeling the gentle kick of the life within her, and switched off the monitor. 2 days after his public humiliation, Ethan was sitting in his lawyer's office, a wild, reckless scheme in his eyes. "I'm going to contest the divorce settlement," Ethan announced. Mr. Davies simply stared at him, his expression one of pure disbelief. "Ethan, you cannot possibly challenge an agreement that you yourself demanded and expedited simply because your ex-wife's financial status has come to light." "Why not? People can change their minds." Mr. Davies removed his spectacles and began polishing them with excruciating slowness. "Ethan, let's imagine you appear before a judge and argue that you wish to nullify your own agreement because you happen to see in an architecture journal that your ex-wife is now the chair of a multi-billion-dollar arts foundation. Can you guess what happens next?" "What?" "The judge will laugh you out of her courtroom for what is transparently the most brazen case of fortune hunting she has seen in her entire career, and then she will likely sanction you for wasting the court's time." Ethan's face flushed with anger, but he pressed on. "What about the baby? I signed away my rights." "You signed a legally ironclad declaration of non-paternity," Mr. Davies said, his tone devoid of warmth. "You stated, in no uncertain terms, that you wish to have no legal or paternal connection whatsoever to that child." "I've had a change of heart," Ethan bit out. "The law, Mr. Holt, does not care about your changes of heart," the lawyer countered. "You made a cold, calculated decision." A long, heavy silence filled the room. "I cannot and I will not represent you in this matter," Mr. Davies finally declared. "What you are suggesting is morally bankrupt, and any judge in this city will see it for exactly what it is." Ethan stormed out. He found a different lawyer, a slicker type named Garrett, with a looser grasp on ethics, who was all too happy to take his money to file for parental rights. They all met in a Chicago courtroom 3 weeks later. Olivia arrived with Miss Monroe and a team of 2 associates from a top-tier law firm. She was dressed in an elegant navy blue maternity dress, her expression serene and unreadable. At nearly 8.5 months along, her pregnancy was obvious. Ethan arrived with Mr. Garrett, wearing his best suit, though the cuffs were beginning to fray. He tried to look confident, but a cold dread was settling in his stomach. The judge was a woman in her 60s, Judge Miller, with sharp eyes, silver hair in a perfect twist, and a look that said she'd heard every possible lie in her 25 years on the bench. "Mr. Garrett," Judge Miller began, peering at Ethan's lawyer over her glasses, "you are petitioning this court to grant parental rights for an infant that is not yet born. An infant whose biological father, your client, willingly and enthusiastically relinquished all legal claims just 2 months ago. You will have to explain this to me." Mr. Garrett rose. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Ethan Holt, has had time to reflect on his actions. He now recognizes he was operating under extreme professional and personal duress. He has a profound love for his unborn child and deeply desires to be a present and loving father." Judge Miller's eyes moved to Ethan. "Mr. Holt, is that an accurate summary?" Ethan stood, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had rehearsed this a dozen times. "Yes, Your Honor. I made a terrible, terrible mistake. I was going through a very difficult period in my life and was not thinking clearly when I signed those documents. Now, however, I see that being a father to my child is the only thing that truly matters." It sounded almost believable, right up until Olivia's lawyer, Miss Monroe, stood. "Your Honor, if I may have the floor." "Proceed, Miss Monroe," the judge said. "Your Honor, Mr. Holt's entire testimony is a work of fiction. He is not driven by some newfound paternal instinct. He is driven by a blatant attempt to access my client's family trust and the endowment of the Sterling Arts Foundation." "That's a lie!" Ethan shouted. Judge Miller's gavel struck the wood with a loud crack. "Order! Mr. Holt, you will get your turn. Miss Monroe, please continue." Miss Monroe approached the bench and handed the judge a large bound portfolio. "Your Honor, we have gathered a significant amount of evidence that will reveal Mr. Holt's actual motivations." Judge Miller began to flip through the portfolio, and with each page, her expression grew colder. First, Miss Monroe announced, we have a collection of dated and verified photographs taken just 3 days ago. They depict Mr. Holt at a champagne lounge with his associate, a Miss Sophie Lane. They were toasting and celebrating on the very night my client was hosting a memorial for her late father. Ethan felt the courtroom floor drop out from under him. Second, we have hotel and credit card receipts proving Mr. Holt was cohabitating with Miss Lane at a luxury hotel for the entire week of his father-in-law's death and funeral. Third, we have sworn affidavits from 23 separate attendees of the memorial service held for Mr. Sterling at the Art Institute of Chicago. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. The scene replayed in his mind with perfect, damning clarity. Him cornering a grieving Clara at her own father's wake in the very house she grew up in. He remembered handing her the divorce papers right there as friends and family were trying to offer their condolences. He remembered the wave of nausea that had washed over her face, the way she had stumbled back from the sheer shock of his cruelty. He remembered turning his back on her and walking out of that house without a single backward glance. The shame was a physical weight threatening to crush him. And then came the memory of the document he had so eagerly signed, the notarized declaration where he voluntarily surrendered every right he had as a father. In that same document, he had even insisted on adding a clause questioning the child's paternity, a final, baseless insult meant to inflict maximum pain. He could almost hear a judge's voice in his head, cold as the Charles River in winter. "Mr. Vance," the voice would say, dangerously quiet, "did you really do this?" He looked at the photo of Clara again, and the answer screamed back at him. Julian's lawyer, Mr. Hayes, was a statue, offering no counter-argument, no objection, nothing. "I can explain," Julian choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Can you?" Judge Albright's voice cut through the silent courtroom. "Explain to this court why you used your wife's family firm to finance and design a home for your mistress. Explain the string of social media posts where you publicly questioned the paternity of your unborn child. Explain why you renounced all parental claims, only to file this suit the day after your wife inherited the Vance architectural fortune, suddenly positioning yourself as a dedicated father." Julian's jaw worked, but no sound emerged. Judge Albright gave a slow, deliberate nod, his silence a clear admission of guilt. "Mr. Vance, I have presided over this court for 25 years. I have seen the absolute best and the most deplorable of human behavior. But rarely have I witnessed a man whose actions so blatantly prove that a child's welfare is his last concern. Every choice you made, from the professional sabotage to this pathetic lawsuit, screams of one singular repulsive motive: greed. Your request for custody is denied with the utmost prejudice. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent restraining order. You will have zero contact, direct or indirect, with Mrs. Vance or her child. Any breach of this order will lead to your immediate arrest and imprisonment. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Julian whispered, defeated. "I'm sorry, what was that?" Judge Albright demanded. "Yes, Your Honor!" Julian cried out, his voice fracturing under the weight of his humiliation. "Mrs. Vance," Judge Albright said, her voice shifting entirely to one of genuine compassion and esteem, "you are granted sole legal and physical custody of your child from the moment of birth. Mr. Vance will possess no rights, no visitation privileges, and no claim whatsoever. This court wishes you and your baby a lifetime of happiness, peace, and stability." "Thank you, Your Honor," Ilara said, her voice unwavering and strong. Julian stumbled from the courtroom, his face burning with shame. In the corridor, people averted their eyes, but they were all whispering. The doors had been open. They had heard every word. They knew precisely what kind of man he was. 2 months later, on a sweltering Charleston afternoon when the air was thick with the scent of jasmine, Ilara gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was grueling, a marathon of 14 hours, but Ilara tapped into a well of resilience she never knew she possessed. And when the nurse finally laid her son on her chest, Ilara studied his tiny, perfect face and was flooded with a love so immense, so profound, it felt like her very soul was expanding. "Hello, my beautiful boy," she murmured, tears of pure joy tracing paths down her cheeks. "I'm your mother. I've been waiting for you my entire life." The infant opened his slate blue eyes and seemed to look directly into hers. In that one instant, every terrible event of the past year, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the public disgrace, the anxiety, it all dissolved into insignificance. It held no more power over her because this wonderful, flawless little human was in her arms. He was hers and she was his. That was the only thing that would ever be important. "What are you thinking of naming him?" the nurse inquired gently. Ilara didn't hesitate. The name had been a quiet certainty in her heart for months. "Theo," she said. "His name is Theo, for his great-grandmother, Beatrice." Ilara remained in the hospital for 2 days. Her room was a garden of flowers, a breathtaking arrangement of white gardenias from the Historical Society, a vibrant bouquet from a cousin, and dozens more from new acquaintances and board members. There were notes and balloons and impossibly small presents for the baby. There was absolutely nothing from Julian. Not a message, not a voicemail, not even a single word. And for his complete and utter silence, Ilara was deeply, immeasurably grateful. When she brought baby Theo home to her meticulously restored historic house south of Broad, everything was flawlessly prepared. The nursery was a masterpiece of classic design, featuring a hand-carved cherry wood crib, soft linen-colored bedding, and a brass mobile of architectural shapes that spun gently in the afternoon light. Books on art and history lined the built-in shelves. A plush rocking chair was situated by the grand floor-to-ceiling window, perfectly placed for Ilara to look out over the historic rooftops of Charleston while she fed her baby. That first evening home, Ilara sat in that very chair, her son, Theo, sleeping soundly in her arms. The city lights began to twinkle, casting a gentle radiance into the room. "You will never have to experience what I did," Ilara whispered to the sleeping baby. "You will never feel the sting of deceit or the coldness of being abandoned. You will grow up surrounded by integrity and love. You will be cherished. You will always be protected." She gently kissed the crown of his head. "Your great-grandmother wanted this for you," she murmured. "She built a dynasty so that you would have a solid foundation to build your own life, and I will honor her legacy. I'm going to create something important with it. I am going to make her so very proud." The baby let out a soft sigh in his sleep, his tiny hand clutching the fabric of her blouse, and Ilara smiled, a single tear of resolve sliding down her cheek. In the months that followed, Ilara poured her energy into building a powerful legacy. She founded the Beatrice Vance Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing seed grants for women-led architectural startups, with a special focus on helping single mothers who were rebuilding their lives after escaping toxic relationships. Ilara understood the sharp pain of discovering Julian's betrayal, how utterly alone she'd felt, how adrift. She refused to let another woman suffer that same despair. She wanted every woman forced to start anew to know she was not isolated, that support was available, and that this painful chapter was not the end of her story. The foundation quickly became a transformative force. Within 5 years, it had helped launch over 1,000 new businesses across 4 states. Ilara was always present at their functions, sitting with the women, listening to their hardships, and celebrating their successes. One evening at a fundraiser, a young woman named Sarah approached her. Sarah was 25, holding a sleeping toddler, and her eyes shone with a fierce determination. "Mrs. Vance," Sarah began, her voice thick with emotion, "I had to come and thank you. When my husband left, I was shattered. I had no professional qualifications, no money. I thought my life was over, but then someone told me about your foundation. Your support, I finally have stability. I'm completing my architecture degree, and my son is in the most wonderful preschool. You built this from the wreckage," Chloe said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. This was all you, Ilara. I just handed you the toolbox. You're the one who restored every beam and polished every floor. Ilara didn't just restore, she revolutionized. Taking the helm of her grandmother's dormant architecture firm, she poured herself into historical preservation and cutting-edge design, just as her family had always envisioned. Some projects faltered, but her successes were iconic. Her wealth grew exponentially. She began speaking at conferences, not about betrayal, but about building a modern legacy on a historic foundation. She became a celebrated authority on Southern architecture and female entrepreneurship. She never mentioned Marcus by name, but Charleston society knew exactly who had ignited her ambition. Real influence, Ilara commented in a now legendary feature in a Charleston lifestyle magazine, isn't about silencing your critics. It's about creating something so magnificent their whispers become completely inaudible. She was lionized. Charleston publications placed her on their covers. She won awards for her foundation's work in preserving historic neighborhoods for low-income families. Esteemed universities invited her to address their graduating classes. She became a symbol of resilience and class, and through it all, little Theo grew up curious, joyful, and full of light. On his first birthday, he took his first wobbly steps across the heart pine floors of their immense South of Broad drawing room, and Ilara's delighted cheers were mixed with happy tears. He was a beautiful child, always laughing and staring with wonder at the gaslights flickering outside their windows. Ilara ensured Theo knew his great-grandmother. Every night, she told him stories of how Grandma B was a trailblazing architect, a visionary who saw beauty in decaying facades, and how she would have adored her great-grandson beyond measure. "Your great-grandmother built things with soul, my sweet boy," Ilara would murmur to Theo, "and you have her spirit. That's a heritage to be fiercely proud of." Marcus's life followed the inverse path. The second the divorce decree was signed, his meticulously curated existence came undone. First, Isabel vanished. She sent a cold, 3-sentence email one morning stating that his personal brand had become toxic and she couldn't afford the professional blowback. She wished him well. Marcus phoned her obsessively for 3 solid days. Every single call was routed to her voicemail. On the 4th day, he discovered she had blocked his number. Isabel, the hungry junior analyst, had excised him from her life as if he were a failed investment. His position at the venture capital firm was the next casualty. The partners who had stayed with him out of a lingering sense of camaraderie finally invoked the morals clause in his contract. The story had spread like wildfire through Charleston's tight-knit financial community. The tale of the financial whiz who was caught presenting his mistress with a custom bracelet, one his pregnant wife had designed, during a charity gala was too scandalous to ignore. No one wanted to be associated with Marcus Thorne. He lost his gorgeous Harbor View office when he was escorted out by security. He sold his sailboat to cover a landslide of legal fees. He abandoned his waterfront condo for a grim, soulless apartment in a sprawling complex far from the historic district. The apartment had paper-thin walls, a window unit that shuddered violently, and a permanent stale smell of damp carpet. Marcus spent his days sending out feelers and his nights staring at the cracks in the ceiling, unable to sleep. He was untouchable. His name was poison. Any headhunter who looked him up was immediately met with a deluge of society blogs, gossipy articles, and thinly veiled accounts of his disgrace. He was a professional outcast. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, with the muffled sound of a neighbor's argument coming through the wall, Marcus would open his phone and scroll through old pictures. There was one from their wedding day, Ilara looking up at him with a level of pure devotion that now felt like a physical blow. There was another from the day she revealed she was pregnant, her face glowing as she held up the tiny sonogram photo, her eyes shimmering with joyful tears. He had been given all of that, a universe of warmth, of loyalty, of true contentment, and he had deliberately and methodically chosen to set it on fire. One afternoon, Marcus was walking through the French Quarter, heading to a courtesy interview he knew was pointless when he saw it. The cover of a glossy magazine in a shop window. It was a photo of Elora holding a giggling baby Theo. She looked magnificent, composed, strong, and utterly at peace. The baby's small hand was nestled against her jaw as she smiled. The headline across the image proclaimed, "The Beaumont Legacy. Elora Hayes is rebuilding Charleston's soul, one home at a time." Marcus Thorne stood frozen on the bustling cobblestone street, the city's sounds of horse-drawn carriages and church bells fading to a dull roar. He gazed at the powerful image of the woman he had discarded and the son he would never know, a hot, acrid burn rising in his throat. He could not get away from her. Elora was Charleston's new luminary, her face smiling from magazines and television interviews where she discussed her philanthropic projects, her bold new architectural ventures, and her plans for community development. Every mention was another twist of the knife. Elora Hayes secures a $10 million preservation grant. The Beaumont Foundation completes its third affordable housing initiative. The Preservation Society's Visionary of the Year award goes to Elora Hayes. The headlines were a relentless chorus, each photograph a new form of torture. An icy, devastating truth finally shattered the fortress of his ego. Elora had never been simple. She had been extraordinary. She wasn't delicate. She was forged from iron. She was never just a piece of his life. She had been the entire architecture, and in his monumental hubris, he had swung a wrecking ball at it. And the destruction was total. The divorce was done, his parental rights terminated by his own signature on the legal documents, a final, irreversible seal on that part of his life. There were no appeals, no do-overs, no paths back. Marcus Thorne, the man who built financial empires, was left with only the wreckage of his own name. It was a humid summer evening, nearly a year after Theo's birth. The sprawling piazza of the historic downtown mansion was bathed in the glow of the setting sun, the light casting a golden sheen over the harbor. Elora sat in a rocking chair, watching her son crawl across a sweetgrass rug. Theo was exploring, a tiny, curious adventurer, moving from a potted fern toward a flickering candle in a lantern. A perfect, happy gurgle bubbled from his lips. Her sister Chloe sat nearby, sipping sweet tea. "He has Grandma B's stubborn chin," Chloe said with a smile. Elora's own smile grew. "I know. Sometimes when he looks at a blueprint just so..." The thought of Marcus is so clear it catches in her throat. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching baby Theo reach for a sunbeam that was filtering through the tall windows. "Your grandmother would be unbelievably proud of you," Chloe remarked softly, "not just for reviving the firm or for the accolades, but for how you carried yourself. The grace you showed when you had every single right to just burn it all down." Elora gently rocked the antique bassinet with her foot. "Do you know the moment I always see?" she asked quietly. "I always return to that gala at the Gibb Museum, standing on that cold marble floor, holding a glass of champagne and seeing that bracelet on her wrist, feeling the entire room just shift beneath my feet. I was so certain my life was over. I believed I had lost everything, that I was absolutely and permanently alone." Chloe reached over and placed her hand on Elora's. "But I was mistaken," Elora went on. "I wasn't alone. Grandma B was still there for me. She had spent her entire life creating a foundation for me that I never fully appreciated until that moment. And the baby." Her expression softened as she looked at Theo, who had just managed to clutch the sunbeam with a little sound of triumph. "The baby was right there with me, a little promise, a tiny flutter that told me I had a reason to fight." Elora paused, her gaze shifting to the palm fronds swaying in the salty air. "I used to believe Marcus broke me," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But he didn't. He simply vacated the space he occupied in my life, and that was the greatest gift he ever could have given me. Not the settlement, not the firm, none of that. The gift was his absence, the room to finally grow into the woman I was always meant to be without his voice in my head telling me my dreams were impractical. Chloe dabbed at her eyes with the back of her hand. When did you get so profound? Ilara let out a genuine deep laugh.
A therapist who charges $400 an hour, she replied. Hours and hours of therapy. Their shared laughter drifted on the warm evening air, carrying over to the bassinet.
Theo turned his head as his mother's voice reached him and broke into a wide, toothless grin, kicking his small feet with delight. "Mama," he babbled, a sound of pure happiness. "Mama! Mama!" Ilara stood and scooped him into her embrace, burying her face in the soft crook of his neck that smelled of baby powder and sunshine. "Hello, my little architect," she whispered. "Did you have fun redesigning the world?" "World," Theo echoed with great seriousness, patting her cheek with his chubby hand. "That's right," Ilara affirmed. "A much better one. You are so brilliant, Theo, just like your great-grandmother." She carried him through the house as the setting sun cast long, elegant shadows across the grand rooms. The home felt warm, alive with the evidence of a life being thoughtfully reconstructed. The main hallway served as a shrine. There was no photograph of a beaming couple on their wedding day. Instead, there was something far more resonant. A large, framed black and white picture of her great-grandmother, Beatrice Vance, looking young and defiant in a hard hat, standing proudly by the steel framework of the first modern high-rise in Charleston's historic district. Ilara paused before the portrait, a nightly ritual. "Say good night to Grandma B," she prompted her son. "G'night," Theo murmured, waving a tiny clenched hand at the photograph. Ilara smiled and proceeded up the sweeping staircase to the nursery. She changed him into his sleep suit, the one patterned with little drafting compasses, and settled into the rocking chair by the tall window to read him a story. Once upon a time, Ilara started. There was a magnificent old house that dreamed of being strong and beautiful once more. Theo snuggled into her shoulder, his breathing already evening out into a peaceful cadence. He was sound asleep before she even finished the first page of the book. She closed her eyes, rocking gently in the quiet room, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of her son's heart against her own. "I need you to know this," she whispered into the growing dusk. "Your great-grandmother loved you before you were even a thought. She spent her life building things that would endure to ensure you would always have a solid foundation, always have a place to call home. Everything we have, all of this, is because she never let anyone tell her what she couldn't do." She softly kissed his fine hair. "And your father," she continued, her voice even quieter, "your father made choices that will be very difficult to explain one day. Perhaps when you are much, much older, we can try to understand them together." "But this is the truth you must always remember, Miles," she whispered. "Your value is never defined by another person's inability to see it. Your worth isn't something that can be diminished by someone else's poor judgment. You are brilliant. You are wanted. You are more than enough. You always have been." Clara placed Miles into his bassinet, pulling the soft linen blanket over his tiny form. The mobile, a collection of miniature leather-bound books, spun gently above him, casting soft shadows on the ceiling. Clara stood in the doorway, watching the steady, peaceful rhythm of his breathing, his little hands curled by his face, innocent, perfect, secure. This was Clara's universe now. It wasn't a fairy tale about a charming financier building a perfect life. This was better. This was real. This was the story of a woman who rebuilt her own world, using her father's wisdom as her foundation, discovering a quiet strength she never realized she had. She was building something extraordinary from the rubble of a lie. Clara dimmed the nursery lights and walked down the polished mahogany hallway to the master bedroom. She paused at the bay window, gazing out at the private, moonlit garden. The small fountain murmured peacefully, and a massive ancient elm stood like a sentinel. Somewhere out there, in a sterile glass condo overlooking the harbor, Leo was likely staring at the city lights, tormented by the life he had so casually destroyed. But Clara knew she hadn't given Leo a serious thought in a long time. He was now exactly what her father had once called a bad investment, a rounding error in an account that had already been successfully closed out. There was no need to re-examine the numbers. She knew her own value and was already designing the future. Clara slipped into the cool, fresh linens of her bed, pulling the comforter up to her chin. On her nightstand, a tablet glowed in the initial plans for the Vance Institute for Bibliographical Studies. Next to it was a framed sonogram, a perfect little profile against a dark background. It was the most important plan in the room, the cornerstone of everything to come. "Thank you, Dad," Clara whispered to the memory of her father. "Thank you for trusting me with this. I hope I'm making you proud." She put the tablet on its charger, switched off the lamp, and closed her eyes. Outside, the city hummed a constant, reassuring hum of existence and motion, and in the distance, a fairy horn sounded its low, mournful call before fading away. Clara Vance slept soundly, and her unborn son slept soundly within her. They were secure, they were cherished, they were, at long last, free. And that, you see, is where their true story begins. Always remember, your spirit is not a stock portfolio that goes to zero just because one investor panicked and sold their shares. Your value is not a rare book to be disregarded by a bidder who never understood its true significance in the first place. Sometimes, the person who walks away from you is inadvertently clearing the stage for your greatest performance. Sometimes, being misjudged is the most powerful position you can be in, because it allows you to build a legacy while no one is even paying attention. And sometimes, the most profound victory isn't about evening the score at all. It is about becoming so accomplished, so genuinely happy, so deeply content, that the person who shattered your trust becomes nothing more than a footnote in the magnificent history you write for yourself. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please press the like button and subscribe for more. Pass this story on to anyone who's ever felt the sting of deceit. Let us know in the comments how you would have dealt with Leo's lies. We're dying to hear your perspective until the next part drops. Hold your head high and remember that you have the power to rebuild your world even from the ashes. This narrative was passionately crafted by our writers to explore the raw truths of heartbreak and the resilience it takes to overcome it. Thank you for being on this emotional journey with us.